Okay, I'm going to read and respond to some comments. Here is one by GeoVoluntarism on fertility and destiny. He said, "It is astonishing that more people haven't figured out that DTT, that's demographic transition theory, is wrong. Though maybe not so much, given the pervasive influence of academia. So far, I've counted more than a few dozen false/incorrect concepts and claims that were taught when I was in school." Yeah. There are a few dissenters in academia, like that guy Eric Kaufman. But yeah, it functions more like a religious institution that propagates dogma. You're allowed to do intellectual work in the margins, but not at the core. You're allowed to fill in little details as long as you don't question core assumptions. But if you question core assumptions, you'll find it pretty difficult to succeed in academia. And that's even true if it's not ideological. Research programs are kind of language games that are set up and perpetuated by people playing them, and they don't like somebody to come in and basically overturn the game, right? Because they've set up this little game that they're playing, and if you say, well, this core assumption of your game is false, then they'll get pissed off because their pretense depends on this false assumption. So that's one of the reasons there isn't a lot of intellectual progress in academia. Unfortunately, it's unfortunate because it would be nice if the academy was an institution for generating and perpetuating knowledge, expanding our knowledge, and if it was dedicated to rationality. But unfortunately, it isn't. So, yeah. I was pretty disillusioned when I went to university. I got up to the level of a master's degree, and I was publishing papers in academic journals. And I realized that I would never be able to do real intellectual work in the academy, that it was almost impossible to do it. It just isn't an institution that does real intellectual work or generates real intellectual progress. All right, let's go on. Here is another one by GeoVoluntarism on how I became amoral. He said, "Ayn Rand was my introduction to philosophy. While I needed to start thinking about philosophy somewhere, her writings led me down the wrong path of believing that morality was objective. Fortunately, I only believed that for 3 years. That wrong turn will cause the naive beginner to run around in circles constantly, searching, pondering, and chasing after something that doesn't exist. Objective morality." Yeah, well, I think most people have a very, very deep kind of intuitive belief in objective morality that they can't really overturn, and so they do this post hoc rationalization of it. I think, though, Ayn Rand is a pretty good introduction to at least the philosophy of ethics or morality because she is an outsider, and she says things like the virtue of selfishness, which is heresy, right? That's a moral heresy. So she's going against the established moral framework, the established moral paradigm of the modern West. And once you start doing that, that leads you to start questioning morality in general, or it doesn't for everyone. A lot of ANCAPs think that they have discovered they've discovered morality in logic or something like that. Like Stefan Molyneux's, what is it? Universally preferable behavior or something like that. So yeah, a lot of people deceive themselves and think they have discovered the true morality, but a more intelligent person would be led to start questioning morality in general and possibly eventually rejecting it. Okay, let's move on here. I'll just read a few by GeoVoluntarism, and then I'll move on to other people's comments. He made quite a few recently, and I wanted to read and respond to some of them, but I won't read and respond to all of them because there are quite a few, and I want to get to other people's comments as well. Okay, so here's another one by him on the case against anarchism. He said, my first steps to rejecting anarchism, specifically anarcho-capitalism, were realizing that, number one, LVT, and I think that means land value tax, should be collected and enforced by a government. Number two, urban planning should be run by a government. Number three, geopolitical realities make anarchism impossible. And number four, believing that a free market can exist without a government to enforce it relies on a circular reasoning fallacy. I later discovered more reasons after those, and I might detail all of them if I start a blog someday. Okay, well, yeah, thanks for your comment. I pretty much agree, although instead of land value tax, I believe in a more general concept of taxing natural resources or natural services, such as the land, but also air, water, and especially the extraction of natural resources from the ground, like, the extraction of coal, oil, natural gas, minerals, things like that, metals, And one of the reasons for that, anyway, I don't want to go off on a tangent about it, but there are other reasons for that, not just that it doesn't punish productivity, but also, and it helps to conserve scarce resources, but also it bootstraps market prices. So I have those three fundamental reasons for my proposed system of taxation. But yeah, it's similar to the land value tax. And then with the other things, yes, I agree with you. You need the government to solve game theoretic problems of cooperation. That's the very high level explanation of it, or justification for it. Large scale cooperation is not possible without a coordination mechanism, and cooperation between strangers is not possible without a coordination mechanism. Or in other words, without a solution to the tragedy of the commons and the prisoner's dilemma. Right? So that's like the very fundamental justification for governance, for the state. But then, yes, also their notion of the free market existing without the state is based on that fallacy, that circular reasoning fallacy. Yeah, they just take for granted that the things that exist when you have the state would continue to exist without it. They don't understand that the state creates this condition of peaceful, voluntary cooperation, that it's the coercion of the state that makes possible this peaceful cooperation between the citizens of the state. And without that coercion, without that monopoly on violence, that peaceful, voluntary cooperation would not exist. It wouldn't be possible. So, yeah, they don't get it, but yeah. Anyway, thanks for your comments. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to another comment by somebody else. This is pretty long. Okay, this is by Questionable Genius. I guess this is my long-lost brother, Questionable. It's nice to see a member of the family in the comments section. Okay, he said, hello, Blithering Genius. In a few of your videos, you've said that you might consider creating a future video/blog post about how desire and motivation work. So I guess I'm going to leave my questions and thoughts about this here. I've done my best to understand your ideas as much as possible, but if I've gotten anything wrong, just let me know. Okay, I'm not going to read all of this. It's very long. Wow. I went through all of it, actually, and responded to his questions. And I also recently put out a blog post that actually presents the theory as a theory, not just like in passing. So I'm going to leave a link to that on his comment. while I'm here. Here's my old friend, Final Fantasy 8911 debater. Good old Final Fantasy. He's, he used to be Final Fantasy 8911, and then I guess his account got nuked, and he came back as Final Fantasy 8911 Returns, and I guess his account got nuked again, and now he's back as Final Fantasy 8911 debater. So unfortunately, all of his earlier comments that he put a lot of effort into have disappeared. And yeah, I don't know what he's doing to get nuked all the time. Probably saying unacceptable things because he's a bit of an emotional moralizer, you could say. Anyway, I'll read his comment and my response to it. This is on Efilism arguing the argument. He said it's not illogical. This is, by the way, this is in reference to an earlier discussion, and I told him to make a separate thread because he was arguing on another comment, and it wasn't really related to the comment. So I said, make another thread and I'll answer your question. So anyway, it doesn't really matter. The context is not important. He's making an argument that nihilism prescribes doing nothing or killing yourself. Okay, so here's his argument. It has two premises and a conclusion. The first premise is nihilism says that nothing has any ought value. Everything has equal value to nothing. The second premise is laws of logic dictate that something, life, that has no ought value logically shouldn't be invested in because something that has no value earns no objective respect. Conclusion, nihilism prescribes that everyone not care about anything and do nothing or end the lives of others and oneself. Now, it's not clear whether he's talking about moral nihilism or value nihilism, and he probably wouldn't even understand or accept the distinction there, but anyway, it's a pretty strange second premise. Somehow the laws of logic are about what we should invest in and what has objective respect, and that's quite a stretch. But anyway, all right, then he said silly counter-argument number 1, and it's the only silly counter-argument he presents, so the numbering is not necessary. Here is the silly counter-argument. No, nihilism says ought is illusion, therefore you can be happy all days long. Okay, so that's his straw man counter-argument. And then he says, debunking counter-argument 1. Nihilism doesn't say ought is illusion. Nihilism says that there is no ought. Nihilism and laws of logic can logically coexist, just like how nihilism and nature can coexist. If there's no good reason to do anything, then logically there's no good reason to even be conscious. Therefore, it would be rational to end consciousness under nihilism. To invest in life under nihilism is absurd, because you'd be using energy in pretending preserving life is valid, when under nihilism it's not. Perfectly valid argument all here, BG. The reason you don't like it is not because it's an absurd argument, but because you think you're entitled to do whatever you want under nihilism, and you have a desire to, and hate anybody else who says otherwise. Do I really... That's kind of funny. There's a bit of projection here in Final Fantasy. I mean, I really don't hate anybody. I mean, when do I go around hating on people? Like, even in Mendham. I mean, in Mendham had to insult me for like 5 hours before I really started being rude, you know? And even then, I don't hate in Mendham. And I want him to continue, you know, doing what he does. I mean, it would be nice if he was a little more rational, but, you know, I appreciate opposing views. So I'm hardly going around hating on people who disagree. I'm just making arguments. All right. He said, there's nothing smart at all about a pro-life nihilist. There's nothing smart about a nihilist that donates their gametes to fertilize others. There's nothing smart about conducting an is just because you want to. All right, so that was his comment. And then I said, for the sake of argument, let's say that nihilism is a complete rejection of value. The nihilist believes that nothing has value, subjectively. He does not value one thing above another. So this is more than just moral nihilism, but I'm just saying for the sake of argument, you could make a similar argument for moral nihilism. But this is value nihilism. The value nihilist doesn't believe that anything has value to him. So it doesn't matter what he does. Okay? Then I said, note that I am not a nihilist by that definition because I value reproduction. Does it follow that the nihilist should do nothing, e.g. lie on the floor, or end his life? No, those choices would have no value to the nihilist, so there's no reason for him to do them, or anything else. For any X, he has no reason to do X, and no reason to not do X. Like, that's what nihilism is, right? Or value nihilism. There is no reason to do anything. Whether it's kill yourself or have an ice cream cone, there is no reason to do it. That's value nihilism. Then I said, this is obvious, but you seem to struggle to understand it, although multiple people have explained it to you before. All right, then I said, in your argument, P1 states that nihilism says that nothing has any ought value. Your conclusion states that nihilism prescribes something, which means nihilism assigns ought value to something in your terminology. So your argument is blatantly illogical. The conclusion contradicts the first premise. Nobody makes silly counter-argument number 1. It is a straw man. It is also very confused, because there is no logical relationship between the existence of value and the possibility of being happy all day long. What was it that he said? Ought is illusion, therefore who can be happy all days long. Yeah, there's no relation between those two ideas, Final Fantasy. There's no relation between value existing and the possibility of being happy. Anyway, I said, you repeat your fallacy again. And I quoted him saying, if there's no good reason to do anything, then logically there's no good reason to even be conscious. Therefore, it would be rational to end consciousness under nihilism. And I said, again, if there's no good reason to do anything, then there's no good reason to end consciousness. So no, it would be no more or less rational to end life than to do anything else, such as go to the park and have an ice cream cone. Do you not understand the meaning of anything? Again, this is blatantly obvious, and you've had it explained before. I am not a nihilist in the sense of rejecting subjective value. I reject objective value and objective imperatives. I value things from my subjective perspective, as I have explained many times before. There are no values imposed on us by logic or the cosmos. Value is a judgment made by a brain from its perspective. So there you go. Anyway, good old Final Fantasy. He said he was going to debunk me, and he still hasn't done it. He said that like over a year ago. He was going to put out a video debunking my video. He still hasn't done it. Okay, let's move on. Here is one by CrustyMoonz on the Ghost of Adam Lanza. He said, "Good on you. You are one of the few people who actually took the time to understand his way of thinking. Most people think he is crazy and feel superior to him due to their beliefs of what crazy means." There's kind of a resistance to understanding these people. And the word crazy is just sort of convenient, right? It's like, it's kind of like the word sociopath. It's really meaningless because it just means, basically just means you're a criminal. If you're a sociopath, you're a criminal. Or, you break the rules. So that's all it really means, but it's presented as if it were an explanation. Like, oh, he's a criminal because he's a sociopath, right? And it just really doesn't mean anything, but for some reason this makes it easier for people to, ignore the question of why people commit crime, because you can just use this label, even though it's a meaningless label and has no explanatory power. You can just use that as a way to pretend you have an explanation for it. Anyway, all right, he said, "I don't know much about the right terms for this, but I agree that life is rape. We never consented to being born in this form of society. I'm surprised this world isn't more full of nonconformists." Okay, well, thanks for your comment. I did try to understand Lanza rather than just moralize about him. I was mostly focused on his philosophy and, understanding it, presenting it, giving it a sort of fair assessment. Now, as for life being rape, well, that is a metaphor. And, Lanza liked that metaphor. Just like Inmendum likes metaphors like that. He likes those kinds of metaphors because they're good rhetoric, I guess, right? They're emotionally compelling. They associate something with a word that already has these negative moral connotations, right? But clearly, life isn't rape. That's, certainly not literally true, and it's kind of a strange metaphor. You don't consent to being born. You don't consent to being alive. You don't consent to living in this kind of world, this kind of society. You don't consent to the laws of physics before you're born. But so what? Obviously you can't, right? Consent is something that exists within a society. You have to have a society before there can even be a notion of consent. It's kind of like the anarcho-capitalists who take something for granted, like the market, and then imagine it existing without the state. You're taking the notion of consent for granted, and you're imagining it existing without society. And it only exists when you have society. And you have norms for establishing rights and obligations within society. So you can't really consent to a society because there has to be a society before consent is even a meaningful concept. All right, let's move on. Here is one by GeoVoluntarism on Incels and romantic illusions. He said, "It is so hard to find an equally intelligent woman who wants to have a lot of children these days. I haven't had any luck with dating sites or dating in general so far. I could probably improve and do things to make myself more marketable, but I don't expect to find someone within the next year or so. I've heard that smarter people tend to find their soulmates at later ages, but such relationships do tend to be more successful on average, so I think there's still hope for me. Great video, by the way. I'm just liking and commenting your videos to improve their selectability by the YouTube algorithm." And I said, "Thanks, I appreciate your comments and likes." Yeah, it's not easy out there, but I think you can succeed with some effort. You can do things to increase your access to women. Change your job, change your lifestyle, change where you live, and that will make a big difference. And I think this is really important, that there are things you can do in terms of how you talk to women or how you interact with women. You need to learn those skills, but you also need to just be in situations where you can interact with women, ideally in a low pressure situation, like not you're approaching a strange woman on the street and asking for her phone number, because the odds of that working are very, very low. But if you're in like a workplace where there are various women and you're getting to know them and you notice this one girl seems to like you and you kind of like her, you signal to each other in subtle ways that you're interested and that you're receptive. She'll signal if she's receptive to being asked out, and then the pressure is down and the probability of success is much, much, much higher, right? So you want to be in situations where you have access to the kind of women that you're interested in dating. Okay, so if you don't currently have access to women or to the kind of women you're interested in, then you should consider changing your lifestyle in some way that will put you in contact with the type of women you're interested in dating, eventually marrying. And the same thing is true for women. Put yourself in a situation where you have access to the type of men that you are looking for, because life isn't a romantic comedy. I mean, it doesn't work like that. You can't just expect to meet somebody by pure random chance who is compatible, that you're interested in, and they will just happen to say the right thing at the right moment in such a way that they will manage to connect with you when you're just walking down the street or whatever, right? To a large extent, this is a numbers game. And so increase the probability of success by having access to more members of the opposite sex. All right, here is a comment by Tio on Life is Violent. He said, this sort of ultra-competitiveness and ruthlessness of life really makes me depressed and disgusted by it all. Makes me want to end it. I really don't know why people create babies in this brutal place. Yeah, I get it, my propagation of genes, bro, but still, it's ugly. Maybe if we weren't raised watching Harry Potter and all those wholesome cartoons, this realization wouldn't be such a big blow. The expectations for what life is are set too high, and then when you grow up, you get punched in the face and realize what's really up. Yeah, I think a lot of people get disillusioned on the internet because they've had the truth hidden from them their entire lives, and then somebody on the internet is just saying it. He's just saying the truth, and you kind of recognize it as the truth, and you're like, wow, shit, life really isn't Harry Potter. It really isn't the Smurfs. And yeah, that's probably a pretty brutal disillusionment. But, well, the truth is the truth. So I said, I understand why people feel that disgust or even hatred of nature after having been deceived by propaganda and fiction their entire lives. If you grow up on cartoons, then basic facts about nature would be profoundly disillusioning. The modern world allows people to become almost completely detached from reality. They use technology and art to create a bubble of illusion around themselves. Nature is beautiful and horrible, but those are just ways of looking at it. Those value judgments are projected onto nature by a brain that is part of nature. Without that brutal competition, there would be no brains and no value judgments. And then he said, well, for me, the horrible parts outweigh the good ones. Just my judgment. I would rather not have been born. Also, have you ever been an antinatalist? How do you deal with the brutal nature of reality in your head? Doesn't the fact that a lot of your descendants will suffer horribly bother you? And I said, no, I've never been an antinatalist. It's kind of funny that, the pretty much the only people on the internet pointing to the reality of nature, although not entirely honestly, not entirely without bias, of course, but the most honest assessments of it are coming from antinatalists and Efilists, especially Efilists. And there's this assumption that you can't just understand nature for what it is. You have to have this moral stance in opposition to it. And so if I understand it, I must be morally opposed to it. But no, I've never been morally opposed to nature. And understanding the brutal reality of nature did not make me morally opposed to it. It made me question morality and realize that morality was a lie. Nature is there. We're in it. We can't escape from it. It's like, much more real than morality, which is this pretense that we have created, this illusion that we have created. All right, I said I've never been an antinatalist. How do I deal with the nature of reality? By understanding it and accepting it. I didn't watch too many cartoons growing up, and I spent a lot of time outdoors observing nature. Suffering doesn't bother me because I'm not a hedonist. I don't value pleasure or pain or any other brain state. I have made quite a few videos on the topic of Efilism. And then he said, what do you mean by value? And how do you know what you value if you don't look at how things make you feel? It seems very strange. Like if I was outside, then it was negative 10 degrees Celsius, I would get the feeling of coldness. After a long enough time, the cold would become unbearable, and then I would realize that I value not being cold. Yeah, you'd probably value it before you even went outside, right? Because you know from experience that that's going to be painful. Then he said, I just can't see how you would be indifferent to the sensation of coldness in that situation. So, of course, I would not be indifferent to the sensation of coldness, but that's not what I said, right? I said that's not value. Anyway, I said you value not being cold. It's not that you negatively value suffering, it's that you negatively value being cold. You value an outcome, not a mental state. Valuing is a mental operation that involves an idea of what is good or bad, and that idea is used to generate action. Valuing is not the same as feeling pain or pleasure. They are related, but not the same. So, for example, in that case, you could put on a coat before you go outside because you value not being cold, and you would never feel cold, right? You would never feel cold. When you came back in, you wouldn't feel, oh, thank God I came in out of the cold. You wouldn't get any pleasure from coming in. But your values would have determined your actions, right? You would have valued not getting cold, so you put on a jacket, and then you don't feel the cold, but you still acted on a value. Okay, so that's an example of the difference. You don't have to feel the cold to value not getting cold. Now, I understand why people might think that what you're really valuing is the pleasure and the pain. You're negatively valuing the pain and positively valuing the pleasure, but that is a fallacy. That is kind of it's a bad metaphor, you could say. Anyway, I said intuitive values arise by induction from emotional experience. You learn that being out in minus 10 Celsius is bad, and you learn that coming in out of the cold is good. A philosophical theory of value is not intuitive. It is an explicit theory of what is good or bad for you. It's an answer to the question, what is the purpose of life? So intuitive values are these things that they're just going to be in your head no matter what, like no matter what you believe, because they just naturally get induced from experience. So like basically everybody has the value in their head, getting cold is bad, going out in the freezing cold is bad. You don't have it in there as like a proposition, as an explicit statement. It's just, that if you look outside and you happen to notice it's snowing, you're going to put on a jacket. Or you're probably not going to go out and, run around in a t-shirt and shorts and roll around in the snow. Unless you're my son who does that kind of thing as a joke or sort of to show off. But, well, I guess in my family we do have this thing where we go outside on snowy days and walk around the house barefoot as a kind of test of endurance. But, we still, most of the time, put on our jackets. Anyway, so like a philosophical theory, though, is not that intuitive stuff. It's not just all this knowledge that we have learned from experience about, what foods are good and what behaviors are good and, what we want, what we don't want. A philosophical theory is an explicit statement of what is good or bad for oneself. And then you could have a moral theory or something like that, or a social value theory, which is what is good or bad for us. Or if it's moral, it would have to be what is good or bad, period, in some objective sense. But of course I reject that. But I can have individual values as an individual and social or collective values as part of a collective. Right? I can say, I think this would be good for us. Do you agree? And if everybody agrees, then we have a collective value. But anyway, that's another story. So we're talking about philosophical theories of value. And that is basically an answer to the question, what is the purpose of life? So once you explicitly ask yourself that question, now you feel compelled to answer it. And the answer will be a philosophical theory of value. It will not be an intuitive value like, the one that makes you put on the jacket before going outside. It will be an idea, a conscious theory or statement of what is good or bad about life for the individual. All right, then I said, many people assume that the purpose of life is happiness, or to feel more pleasure and less pain. That's hedonism. When I was young, I started questioning that assumption after I noticed that pain and pleasure balance out. For example, if you expose yourself to low temperatures, you will experience pain and you will be motivated to warm up. Then when you come in out of the cold and warm up, say by having a warm bath, you will experience pleasure. You could not have experienced that pleasure without the preceding pain. You can't experience the pleasure of coming in and warming up unless you're cold, right? Try it on a summer day when you're warm. Is getting into a warm bath pleasant? No. But if you're hypothermic, it's extremely pleasant. It's like, oh my God, oh, this is so great. Same thing with food. If you go without food for a couple of days and eat a hamburger, it's going to be like one of the most pleasurable experiences of your life. Okay, it's going to be better than the best gourmet meal that you could ever eat when you're not that hungry. I still have these memories of the intense pleasure of eating a meal when I first come back from a long wilderness trip, and usually the tail end of it, I'm out of food. There's usually a couple of days at the end when I don't have any food, and I'm hiking through the wilderness or I'm canoeing down a river with no food, and I'm just starving. I'm like really, really hungry because I'm working. I'm doing a lot of physical labor on 0 calories or very low calories, and then when I get that first meal, whatever it is, it's like fucking paradise. Almost nothing can be that pleasurable. But to experience that intense pleasure, you have to experience the pain of hunger. You have to go without food for a long enough time to build up a very strong motivation to eat. And then you can relieve that motivation. And that will be pleasure. The satisfaction of the motivation is the pleasure. Okay, I gotta stop digressing. Well, it's not really a digression, but I'm elaborating, I guess. So I said, being out in the cold is a cause of pain, but it is also a cause of pleasure. It is necessary to experience the pleasure of warming up. That example shows the basic structure of the motivation mechanism. Intuitively, you will learn to negatively value being out in negative 10 degrees Celsius. And you will learn to positively value warming up. But not because the former causes net pain and the latter causes net pleasure. The net pain minus pleasure is 0, because the pain of getting cold is balanced by the pleasure of warming up. You can try this experiment yourself. It's very easy to do, right? I mean, go out in the cold, or do something like, go for a polar bear dip, go swimming in the ocean in the winter, if you don't live in Florida, and then come inside and get into a warm bath or get into a hot tub or something like that. Okay, you experience intense discomfort or pain, whatever you want to call it. Then you get into the warm bath, you can experience intense pleasure. The intensity will be the same. And I said I don't want to spend too much time on YouTube comment discussions because I've already said this stuff better elsewhere. I have many videos in which I talk about these topics. I'll probably make some videos specifically about hedonism and motivation in the future. I recently made a blog post that deals with a lot of questions regarding pain, pleasure, hedonism, etc. It's called Responding to Alias Fedding. I also have a Discord server that has links to audio recordings that aren't on YouTube. And yeah, I also have just put out a blog post called How I Rejected Hedonism, and I have another one that's almost ready to go out called Motivation that goes into detail about the mechanism of motivation and how it creates the subjective experiences of pain and pleasure and how it's linked to value and action, and I go over all of that. What the will is, basically why we do things. Because we're motivated to do them. And why do we experience pain and pleasure? Because motivation goes up and down. In a nutshell, that's what's in there, but there's a lot more in there. All right, here's one by Max on Incels and Romantic Illusions. He said, the sexual cognitive asymmetry between men and women seems almost self-evident to me. But I think a contributor to the problem is also that modernity has individualized entertainment through video games, for example, to such a high degree that traditional society has suffered immensely, and this has hurt in-person relationships generally, romantic or not. Yeah, I totally agree. Many things are going on. I think the biggest thing is the sexual revolution, the change in the dynamics of mating caused by modern civilization. But yeah, alienating modern technology is a big problem in itself. And it's certainly exacerbating this problem of getting men and women together. Because now they have better ways of fapping, essentially. And I've talked about that in reproduction versus masturbation. Okay, here's a comment by endkerhi jasdaz on How I Became Amoral. He said, I guess you wouldn't be much of a genius or sound as cool if the story was that you were born amoral, like Ayn Rand or Trump or whatever, and not become at 10 years old. And I said, that makes no sense. Philosophical amorality is a conscious, rational rejection of morality. It is the rejection of a delusion. Everyone is born amoral in the sense that they don't have the moral delusion, and also in the sense that they are selfish. Children acquire the belief in good and evil from others in much the same way that people acquire religious beliefs. Or I could have said language, right? Like if you grow up in a certain kind of society with a certain culture, a certain language, you're going to learn that language. You're not going to really consciously, you're not going to have conscious access to that knowledge. You're not going to necessarily be able to explicitly state the grammatical rules of the language, but you'll know how to apply them. You'll know how to use them. You'll recognize grammatical and ungrammatical speech. You'll be able to generate grammatical speech. You'll be able to understand what people are saying and communicate with them. And, it's similar with morality. You grow up in a culture that has a bunch of moral assumptions baked into it that are then used by people. So you hear people saying, that's good, that's bad, don't do that, little Johnny, be nice to her, stop pulling her pigtails, yada, yada, yada. And so you acquire this moral knowledge from experience in much the same way that you acquire the knowledge of language or, religious beliefs. And part of this moral delusion, it's not just what is generally regarded as good or bad, but it is the belief that what we're talking about is something objective, that there is objective good and evil, and an objective imperative to be good and not be evil. And if you reject that, if you say, wait, there is no objective good or evil, there is no objective value, there are no objective imperatives, there is a society, there is a culture, there are cultural values, there are collective values, there are social imperatives, but these things are not objective. They don't come from logic, they don't come from the structure of the cosmos, they don't come from physics, they don't come from biology, they don't even come from the structure of the human brain. They're part of culture. That's why they differ from one culture to another, from one time to another. And that's also why people, are hypocritical, because they tweak their own personal morality to fit their own personal situation, to benefit them. Like in a war, both sides view the other side as evil and their side as good, right? So it's just like all the religions can't be right. So it makes much more sense to understand that, they're all delusions. It's the same thing with all the moralities. All the moral judgments can't be right because they're conflicting. And so it makes more sense to understand that, they're all delusions. They're all perspective dependent, and that we're not recognizing real good and evil that exists independent of society and culture. We're recognizing something that we create collectively, right? When you recognize grammaticality, whether an English sentence is grammatical or not, you're not recognizing something that is like a logical truth. You're not recognizing something that is true because of physics. You're recognizing something that is true because of culture, right? The grammar of English is a cultural thing that is created by people basically just agreeing on it without explicitly stating it. They just find a coordination point. By trying to communicate, they create a way of communicating, and that way has certain rules, and those rules are the rules just because everybody uses them. Just like money has value because everybody believes it has value. It's the same kind of thing. It's circular. So anyway, we can create collective values by tacitly agreeing that certain things are good or bad, but that's all that is. And being philosophically amoral is understanding that that's all it is, that it's not objective good or evil, and that I don't have an objective imperative to be good or to not be evil. I just have incentives, and I live in a society. All right, here are a number of comments by Chainsaw, Excalibur, Crimson Fish on the Ghost of Adam Lanza. And I'm not going to read most of these, but I'll just read one that I'll read two that sort of sum up his position. He said, incels are idiots. So he's first of all blaming this on being an incel, which is not really, I don't think, the motive here. But it's also you can't explain somebody committing mass murder as, well, they did it because they're an incel, because 99.99% of incels never commit mass murder. So that's not an explanation. Like, if a very large percentage of incels committed mass murder, then maybe it would be kind of an explanation. But it certainly isn't a sufficient condition for somebody to commit mass murder, right? I mean, it changes the probability that they will do it, if at all, only very slightly. So it really isn't an explanation. And of course, it doesn't explain Lanza's philosophy either. It doesn't explain his views. Like, in this case, it would be 99.999999, whatever percent of incels never develop a philosophy like Lanza's. I mean, you can find philosophies that are similar, or philosophical views that are similar, like in Mendham's or Schopenhauer's. You can find people with kind of similar views, but his were pretty fringe, right? And I believe what he said, that he came up with these ideas himself, not in a vacuum, because nobody is in a vacuum. He had cultural ideas out there, but I think his story makes perfect sense, that he started out as a primitivist, rejecting culture and cultural values, and he believed these were like artificial values imposed on top of the real feral values, And then he came to see feral values as just as much of an illusion and imposition as cultural values. Although I guess he retained a kind of hatred of culture that he never quite felt for life. But anyway, so I find Lanza interesting, and I don't find these comments interesting, and I think it's really just a cope. Another one he said was, Lanza was virgin loser. Yeah, that's just so interesting, right? He also said he should not have sat in room all day, should have gotten fresh. It really bugs me when people say could have and should have instead of could have and should have. I'm a bit of a grammar Nazi, I guess. All right, he says, should have gotten fresh air, exercise, get laid, go for a swim, communicate with friends, get a part-time job. So this is so stupid because this is exactly what Lanza was critiquing. People who have never examined their own values, never questioned them, never had a philosophical thought in their lives, just imposing their values, saying, this is what you should do. You should do this, and you should do that, and you should do this, and you should do that. Trying to bully their values onto you. This is exactly what Lanza pointed out and rejected. So this is really a clueless comment. But, you're going to get a lot of comments like that on a video about a mass murderer, especially if he has unusual ideas. I get a lot of similar comments on the Elliot Rodger video. People saying, he should have just tried to talk to girls, or he shouldn't have been such a arrogant, snotty jerk. These are such stupid things to say, right? Nobody really cares what Elliot Rodger should have done. I mean, the obvious thing he shouldn't have done is killed a bunch of people and then killed himself, right? Yes, we all know that there are ways that you can pursue love, romance, sex, and all these things. Yes, we all understand Elliot Rodger was not doing a great job of it. We all understand that he had some crazy notions in his head. I mean, I don't know why people feel the need to say that sort of stuff. It's just so silly. Like, it's so profoundly uninteresting. All right, here's one by endkerhi jasdaz. And this is on Indigo, a video I made a long time ago. He said, loved your book and anything from your blog that I've checked out so far. Oh, by the way, I was watching some of your older videos that I had somehow missed, like this one, and then he linked to a video I made that in which I think I talked to my daughter very briefly and included a little bit of dialogue between us when I was sitting on the top of a cliff or something. I think I was just trying to make a little video of being on top of the cliff, and my daughter was asking me questions about what would happen if you fell off the cliff or something like that. Anyway, I don't remember the details, but that's what he linked to, and then he said, and some others, and I was wondering, is your offspring count still just 2? Which, by the way, I've never said I had 2 kids, but he must have, I guess, inferred that from some videos that he watched in which I mentioned 1 or 2 of my kids, like probably my youngest son and my youngest daughter or something like that. Anyway, he said, which ones came from your official wife? And which ones came from that fresh bunch in their early 20s you had selectively captured and chained at your vocation home's hidden basement? I think he meant vacation home, not vocation home, but who knows. He said, not sure who it was from the guys that sent me the pics. But god damn, that bleeding unconscious blonde specimen on the right with the huge breasts probably toped even some of my best ones. Let me know if she's for sale, in case you aren't bored of her yet. I think you mean in case you are bored of her yet, right? Why would I sell her if I wasn't bored of her yet? This guy is not good with grammar or logic. Anyway, he said, I've actually found that if you spread them in more than one basements, they expire later, since the quality of the air postpones their aging process. can make some last even up to 25 to 27. Plus, the pregnancies tend to have less complications. That should be fewer complications. If you're going to write this kind of fan fiction, you should at least use proper grammar and spelling, you know? I mean, put some effort into it. You put a lot of effort into the fantasy, but put some effort into the presentation. All right. Anyway, he said, hey, hope the hottest ones have been giving you some good daughters and the smart ones some good sons. I was actually pretty lucky with that part. To be honest, I've been capturing most of mine from U of T. Best student unions I've seen. One of the recent ones has actually been to that Harris-Peterson event. Never used that one as a breeder again, after she told me about that shit. I mean, even if I only kept from her the ones that are females, they would still be too fucking dumb, even for a daughter. Am I right? So he's got some, like, this is like obviously a satire or something like that of my views or of like right-wing views, I guess. But, yeah, it's just he really doesn't get it. And, yeah, my daughters are pretty smart, and so are my sons. Can't really complain. All right, then he said, by the way, do you have any interesting suggestions for pickup areas? Where do you capture most of yours from? And where do you bury the ones that have passed 25? Or the ones that give you males that still score below 130 IQ, even after they hit 8 years? Or the ones that turn out to have more than 15% African ancestry, etc. Anyway, hope I helped with those tips. I've grown a lot of respect for you through your videos. Like, and then he links to what are obviously the videos that triggered him the most. How I Became Amoral, and Evolution and Morality. So clearly this guy is triggered by his moral delusions being overturned. Like, this bothers him, but instead of saying, oh yeah, I guess I have a delusion, or instead of just ignoring what I say, he's making a weird appeal to consequences, which is of course a fallacy, but it's an attempt to like somehow, like this is somehow his counter-argument, that well, if you don't believe in morality, then you're going to be this monster. But I'm like a law-abiding citizen who pays his taxes, has a long-term relationship, has 5 children, not 2, with my wife. And yes, I donated sperm, which is legal, and it's cooperative because people want the sperm. So it's all been done through voluntary arrangements. It's all been done voluntarily, legally, and that's the best approach. All right, anyway, he said, like these videos and articles and book. I was even planning to share some favorite collection with some gentlemen from the Union in our next event in memory of Jeffrey. Fuck, I miss Jeffrey. Those were the days. Wish you had met him. You'd love him. He's been missing most of the Union events since that staged jail death crap. Andrew and Donald still come sometimes. So I guess Prince Andrew and Donald Trump and Jeffrey is Jeffrey Epstein, right? But why Trump and not Clinton? Didn't Clinton go to that island? I don't think Trump went to that island. I think Clinton did, or at least he flew on that plane a lot. But this guy is probably a leftist, so it's got to be Trump, right? Trump's the evil villain. Anyway, then he said, even they can't fill the void, though. Yeah, Jeffrey Epstein does leave a pretty big void. Did he even have kids? I don't think he even had kids. Personal life, girlfriends, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, I don't think he had any kids. So he's a huge loser. But he was interested in eugenics and transhumanism, apparently. Well, I don't know too much about him, but yeah. Interesting character. Okay, he said, wish you had met him. Oh yeah, I already said that. He said, well, fuck it, you know what? You're invited to our next event. I'll come pick you up with my new hydrocopter from that beautiful house by the lake of yours. I'll be waiting for the coordinates. And I said, well, thanks for your interest, but all my offspring are by legitimate means, with my wife or by sperm donation. I had 5 with my wife before I made any videos, so not sure where you got the number 2 from. Not sure how many I had by sperm donation. So, yeah. I mean, this is such a bizarre comment. Like, imagine putting all this effort into writing this fan fiction comment, which, by the way, went into my spam folder, and it could have easily just gotten deleted because I don't check it very often. But yeah, he went to all this effort to write up this fan fiction, and for what? This is your copium for morality being a delusion? How is this going to help you cope with that? I don't know.